Professor Magalhães Correia, Chairman of the Board of Fidelidade. Good afternoon. I'd just like to welcome you. I'm going to be very brief, and I'm very pleased to see this room with many young people, which is quite inspiring for us. Welcome to the Fidelidade conferences. I'd like to thank your presence. I'd like to thank the work, the time and dedication that the speakers have dedicated to this seminar, to this conference cycle. And I'd like to thank the curators of this event, António. Thank you all. We have chosen a word for these conferences, change. We're not very original, because if something that we're all aware is that the world has changed a great deal. The world changed more rapidly than we would have imagined, and in most circumstances the world didn't change for the better, but something changed for the better. The axiom which has dominated the business life in the last 50 years, the main goal of growing without taking into account the so-called negative externalities, has been overcome for a new type of growth, a sustainable growth. And this new paradigm, if you will, has gone beyond the scientific context, intellectual and political context, and it become a demand in citizenship and even in moral terms. It is precisely for the scope and the priority that this topic has for all that we had today. And during 2 days we will we will exchange views and we will discuss this. The first day will focus on climate change, the impact that climate change have on economy. I'm not going to tell you much about us, but in the Fidelidade group we believe that given our size and the nature of our business, we can play a very important role. We can become influencers in terms of having an impact on more sustainable behavior, but we have to walk our own path. We are learning, as we all are. We are currently studying our environmental impact in terms of the collaboration with the clients and suppliers, and also in terms of the investors. We are Fidelidade as one of the second or third institutional investor in Portugal, so that gives us a very powerful way of intervening, selecting the areas where we invest. This is something that will allow us at the beginning of the 2023 to have a clearer vision of our strategy, mitigation and adaptation to climate change. In the meantime, while this work is going on, what have we done? We are now building the capacity of our teams and try to internally consolidate. This is work we do on our daily basis. We are internally consolidating a culture of sustainability in each of the staff members of Fidelidade Group, because we believe that this topic starts from the inside. For us, it's not just a question of responding to regulatory issues, and even less to follow trends, as we see so often in an artificial way. It's rather the need of revising our business models in accordance with other type of criteria and other requirements. Because if you come to think of it, this is a condition for survival of our own activity. We are basically, well, we do have hospitals, Luz Saúde, and we're an insurance group, but we are basically, we assume risks, and we see how global heating, for instance, is causing the increase of extreme weather events. such as the terrible forest fires which devastated the country in 2017, the recent hurricane which devastated Florida state. Let me guarantee that the insurance business and reinsurance business is one of the most affected if for some reason we would fail on the actions against climate change. We have an optimistic vision about Portugal, and we believe that Portugal has a great opportunity. We can go further in the decarbonation process. We are a country with an important weight of renewable energies. A substantial part of our energies is renewable. We have wind, sun. We don't have polluting heavy industries. We have more forests than agricultural land, and we have very efficient energy companies, very competitive. And practically all of them, not to say all, are our clients. Tomorrow we'll discuss diversity and inclusion, a very relevant topic, where we have very consolidated positions, but although there's still a great deal to be done. But my colleague Rogério Henrique, CEO of Fidelidade, will discuss this tomorrow when he will open tomorrow's works. Let me ask Liliana Coutinho, her team, the curators, for having accepted the challenge of collaborating with Fidelidade in the organization of these conferences. Thank you all and wish you the very best for your work today. We ask Mark de Puta, the chairman of the executive committee of Culturgest. Hello. On behalf of Culturgest, I'd like to thank all your presence and the presence of speakers and moderators of this conference that will share their experiences during the afternoon. I'd like to thank their generosity. I'd like to thank the curators of this cycle, Liliana and António. This is the third cycle of conferences that we organize jointly with Fidelidade. So I'd like to thank Fidelidade for their trust in us. It's been a great pleasure to work with Fidelidade in this cycle. This is the third edition. The first was in artificial intelligence, the second on longevity and the impacts of demographic changes. And now we will be discussing another topic, which is extremely important for the future of mankind, the most urgent of the three. It is a pleasure to be with you here. Yesterday, there was another report of the United Nations where stating that out of the 193 countries which committed with climate mitigation actions, out of the 193, only 26 are on the right path regarding their commitments. We all know that it is not very positive. In the same report, we could read that if there was no drastic reduction, i.e. if the 130 many countries wouldn't start doing their work, the temperature will increase between 2.1 and 2.9. Percent down to the times of the pre-industrial revolution. And we all know, and we've heard it quite often, then 1.5 would be the maximum that the Earth could endure if we wanted the Earth to still be a pleasant place to live as a community. Of course, that we will have a huge challenge ahead of us, and I believe that it has become clear that this is not just up to the governments, but all of us have some responsibilities at personal level, in terms of the civil society and in terms of the companies and institutions. This is why we're here to specifically discuss this topic, how companies and institutions can play an active role in this global effort. Culturgest has been developing many activities during these 2 decades, conferences, webinars, shows, exhibitions related to the topic of environmental crisis and climate crisis. Culturgest is also the coordinator of an European consortium, Act Art Climate Transition, which is working at European level in the dynamization of efforts within the world of culture and the world of arts to change into a more sustainable system. Of course, that we, just like companies, have a long way to go. And this conference is just another step. I wish you a wonderful afternoon, a great deal of discussion, and thank you again for being here. Hello. I'd like to say a couple of words before calling our guests speakers. My name is Liliana Coutinho. I'm the programmer of debates and conferences at Culturgest, and I'm the coordinator together with António, who's here with us this day. You have heard about this day. We had a cycle of 2 days with different topics, but both having to do with the planetary responsibility in terms of the challenges which we have nowadays, environmentally and socially. The agenda is online. You have brochures that you probably have. And before passing the floor to António, who's an economist which has a wide experience in this relationship between economy and environment, and who has this experience of thinking about the future, of creating possible scenarios for the future, and this is exactly what we're trying to do. I'm very pleased to hear that there is this generation mix, and we have very young people following this discussion. They've been important for this topic of the climate change to be on the agenda. The persistence of the young people is very important for these discussions to take place. The question which is crosses generations, and your questions will be welcome during the Q&A. I'm passing the floor to António. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Liliana. I'd like to thank your presence. I believe that you've chose wisely in coming here, and I hope that we can prove that that was a good option. When we meet and we invest some time during a couple of afternoons of our lives in such a session, we are showing our willingness to open up our minds, to reinforce our expectations about the future, though the future does not exist. It's not just like a water bottle. These expectations have an impact on our daily decisions. So this is why we really have to take care of them, to realize whether they're still true, robust, or they're just fears or prejudices. And this permanent discussion on the future, based on what we know today, is very relevant, because it's going to be decisive for the series of decisions we will make. In the morning, there were some workshops. Some of you were here on very important topics. How not to sell sustainability, how not to do greenwashing. We had a climate mural that allowed us to understand that we do not know as much as we think, but about relations between climate, planet, economy, and a workshop on innovation. How can we learn from nature to look for something new? In the afternoon, we're going to have 2 strategic dialogues with small presentations, brief presentations by our guest speakers, and then a discussion where we hope that you will participate. The first one around innovation and institutions, how all these changes we're witnessing, how do institutions, public, private or social institutions, are reacting to the challenge. And the second discussion, more focusing on the relations between economy of the environment and emissions, if you will, CO2 emissions. These two, and together with climate, they're permanently in dialogue, which constitutes the biggest challenge for the next years. We will finish off with our keynote speaker, Valerie Keller, who believes that a small number of people, although small but very motivated, can change the world. So this is why we're going to listen to her at the end of the day and hear her arguments. Thank you. I'd like to call our guest speakers up on stage.
Olá a todos e a todas.
Hello, my name is Ana Pimentel. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon of conferences on Culturgest. I'd like to thank Fidelidade, Culturgest, and the Organization of Change for the invitation. It's going to be a very interesting afternoon for all. So thank you. Welcome to this event. And now let's go direct to the main topic. We have 2 speakers. I will start by introducing Sofia Santos. She's a university professor at WavEC. She's an expert economy specialized in green climate sustainability. She's a consultant Green Climate Fund for Africa, and she's a founder of Systemic. Systemic is a company developing projects in the area of sustainability for other companies, institutions. Also, Professor António Sarmento. He's a doctorate in mechanical engineer by the IST. He's a founder and chair of WavEC Offshore, whose mission is to create sustainable solutions for the blue economy through innovation and knowledge transfer. And he's the founder of Ocean Energy Europe. So welcome you both to this conference. I'm going to pass the floor to Sofia Santos, who has something important to tell you. Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Sofia Santos. I'd like to thank your presence because it's very good to be in a big room. And it's good that more than 50% in the room are under 30 years of age. For me, something new. So thank you very much for having come here. And I hope that at the end of the day, you get a few more ideas than when you came in. What I was asked was try to answer these 2 questions. A sustainable future can really be designed, and what is the true role of institutions to promote these so-called sustainable development you talk about. I'm an economist. And as an economy, I start by discussing GDP. You can see on this graph a weird scale. It's the growth of GDP at worldwide level. After 1950s, the world GDP grows exponentially like a line, vertical line. Imagine that this graph would be you analyzing the sales volume of a company, and if it showed this line, if it were the turnover, we had several questions to understand whether there's been an error on the Excel sheet. We could ask, how did this growth come about? If this truly feasible, it is going to keep on happening. Is this all turnover? How can you achieve this? What lies behind such an exponential growth? What is happening as an impact of this exponential growth? I would never ask these questions as an economist in relation to GDP, because we in econ believe that we're all supposed to grow, and the goal of the GDP is to grow, and the goal of the turnover of companies is to grow. So we like to look at these graphs, and we forget that these graphs may have an impact which we believe was very far away, but in fact today we're already feeling. So economic growth, after the 1950s, the end of the Second World War, reindustrialization, so the utilization of plants which used to produce weapons and armament, and you had to take advantage of these facilities and increase consumption. Why the 1950s? There's marketing now to increase our need to consume, to have more businesses, more industries, and we are living in different worlds. The world where we live in Portugal is a paradise, notwithstanding the difficulties, and some part of Europe is still a paradise, but in fact we're living with this concept of buying, consumption, and the majority of what we buy is produced in another world, very far from us, with bad labor conditions, with bad education. So we forget this discrepancy that the world shows. But the social component is going to be discussed tomorrow, so let me just give you this focus. Most of our clothes is made by child labor. 90% of the chocolate you eat. Likewise, I'll try to understand what is the origin of our products, the impacts associated to our products and services. But the day is now dedicated to climate. What economists never forget, why we're here today, why climate is a problem, why climate change is an issue. When we look at the GDP increasing, we do not hear scientists. Scientists are very far. Let's say since the 70s, I've been telling us that this will happen. So what happens if GDP increases, if the economic system has a series of variables and there's a growth in the GDP, the system has its own variables, and the variables still increase. What has increased simultaneously after the 50s? We see an increase of CO2 emissions, an increase of methane, an increase of acidification of oceans, of the fish catches, so a deterioration of planet Earth because of the increase of consumption of raw materials that, if need be, they are necessary for the GDP growth, so for the impact that the pollution and the industrial activity had on the planet.
Pensar que aquilo.
What do we forget? Well, we forget about our companies because the externalities said that this would be resolved by the market. And that was not the case, because today the world of externalities, and where we said that through taxes or through the rise in prices we're going to manage to decrease pollution. To simplify things for younger colleagues here, but I'm not going into details. But in reality this did not happen in the market, because if not, we wouldn't have the imbalance that we have today in the planet. If externalities had worked, and then we would not have the climate change, and the market would have been sufficiently intelligent to anticipate the fact that today this problem could occur and would anticipate it and avoid it. So what's the main concern? You've all seen this, but the problem is that these different impacts that were shown, and what is attacking is the fact that there is an increase in temperature. And this increased in temperature, 91% of scientists say that this is due to human and economic activity. And what's the main problem? Is that we have to think, why we're here today, what's the main problem? That is, if the temperature of the world increases more than 1.5 degree in relation to 1800, the scientists can't foresee what's going to happen. It's the same thing that happened in Portugal or in Lisbon, 3 or 4 years ago. It was December, there was a storm, they said it was coming to Lisbon, and in fact it ended up in Figueira da Foz. And so if the temperature rises more than 1.5 degrees, we don't know where. A scientist that cannot identify exactly what's going to happen, and the country is not going to, or the countries are not going to be able to create resilience throughout the territory, and so we're going to have physical, human and financial damages. And so most of these damages don't have insurance. They're going to affect the financial sector, given that the companies will not be, people will not be able to pay the debt caused by this damage. And so the objective is to make sure that until the end of the year, the temperature doesn't rise by more than 1.5 degrees, whereas in Portugal it's already gone up 1.3 degrees. 1.5 in Portugal, in global terms about 1.3. Meaning that the probability of having a planet under our control is almost zero. And so we're moving towards having a planet where we're not going to be able to control the climate because we're not acting sufficiently fast to avoid this increase in temperature. And this will come out in The Guardian this week. And what does it say? Maybe the next pandemic may come from melting glaciers. That is, the glaciers. Nobody really studied what is underneath glaciers. There's bacteria, there's loads of things. And nobody's ever been in contact with that, so we don't really know what's there. It's got its own life. And so if we get in contact with these bacteria, are things going to be okay or not? And so there's an alarm here because things may not go well. So the glaciers are melting because the temperatures are going up. Well, a reinsurer, Swiss Re, says that basically, and we should include this in economic models, that the increase in temperature brings down GDP. Now, even if we manage to reach an increased temperature level less than 2 degrees, we're going to have damage, physical damage and human damage, which are not going to be paid. Damage for the economy. And so the more the temperature increases, we're going to 0.6, 0.3, the higher the temperature is, the lower the GDP. And so we're going to have a less minus 18% GDP by the mid-century. Now, if the increase in temperature brings down the GDP, macroeconomic models should have this component involved in order to promote a certain consumption. This can bring up the temperature or bring it down. And this part has been ignored. Another relevant part is to understand that more than 50% of the GDP depends on nature. This is the World Economic Forum that says that is businessmen and women, most are still men, and for about 50% of the GDP depends on nature. And in Portugal, well, I would say Portugal, GDP, more than half of the GDP depends on nature, because if we don't depend on nature, what's going to happen to the GDP? It's going to decrease. And we're moving towards this because a number of international studies identify that there are different species, different matters that are decreasing there being decrease in terms of availability in the ecosystem, and so the GDP goes down because nature has also decreased. And so this is a new formula for the GDP. You just put it as a challenge. Well, what is the GDP of a country? It corresponds to wants, the consumption that is made, private investment, public investment, exports, less, minus imports. And so we have to find a variable for the GDP to take away the increase in temperature. We have to add something in order to include the maintenance of biodiversity. See, if the maintenance is positive, then there'll be less destruction. And this is how you measure a GDP, although the parts in red were here because we've never actually measured these two parts in red. And so the GDP only measures that which is given a value by the market, and there are many things in life that does not have a market value. So the GDP does not measure that thing, and that is why we have this climate change, because we have never actually valued this component. Question: can this future be more sustainable? Well, I think it's being drawn out, and I'm going to speed things up. We have the agenda of 2030 for sustainable development, and we can think of what a GDP, a true GDP, should be able to answer and attribute values to these different dimensions. But we also have the Paris Agreement, where many countries agreed, and the only way for the temperature not to rise more than 1.5 is to achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. And that's on the first phase, and then Europe said we in Europe want to be carbon neutral in 2050. And so this is a challenge that we have. And in Portugal also has a plan, which is the roadmap for carbon neutrality, which says what we have to do, or what is our view, that is where we want to reach, and what does it mean? Carbon neutrality in 2050 for Portugal. What does it mean? It means that we have to increase CO2 sequestration on that, which the natural sequestration. These numbers are a little bit complicated for you, but all our energy consumption, imagine that it has to be all renewable energy. Cars all have to be electric, but but we're talking about 100% renewable. And so the production of CO2 in terms of electricity, how do we speed this up? The European Union in 2018, nobody realised this because they were asleep, in 2018, launched this action plan, where it had 3 objectives, and if you read, and for those of you who are more interested in the economy and the financial market, these three objectives there, but it's as if we're talking about another planet. And what the European want is to redirect the capital flows to sustainable investments, in order to have sustainable inclusive growth, and to manage financial risks resulting from climate change, and to promote transparency and a long-term view in the economic and financial activities. And none of this has happened. I'm not going into detail, but I think that there's a lot of demand of workforce to work on these matters, to go from money to green money, that is to start financing only projects that are more sustainable, that are moving towards sustainability. There are quite a few regulations and directives have come out, but they're having great difficulty in implementing them because everything is very new and these topics were not studied at school. And to conclude the question, it was, so what about the future? Are we moving towards that future? It depends. It depends on you. It depends on all of us. So what is real is a central bank have made these scenarios, and there are 3 main scenarios. And I think this, I'm asking you to concentrate because this isn't easy. There's the first that is visions of the future. Then there's the orderly scenario, which assumes that all the regulation that I mentioned is embraced by companies, and so all of us are moving to very fast in order to bring down the CO2s and bring about new technologies. And then, okay, we managed to have no physical impact, and that is to low environmental impacts. And then we have the disorderly scenario. That is, we're going very slow. We are going very slow with the question of transposing regulations, and we're going very slowly. And then what do we have at the same time? Even more environmental disasters, a number of total catastrophes, and this means that there's all disorderly, and then suddenly the tax on the carbon would be 200%, and so we're moving what? The world is hot. No, that is so we don't do much. We're very slow because we don't think it's going to happen. And then in the future, there are a number of environmental disasters. Some are going to feel a lot, others not, because they won't be here. And so, what is underlying this idea? That is that the best way forward, and the economic scenario that brings less damage, economic damage for the world and for institutions and financial institutions, is the orderly scenario. That is a scenario that we embrace legislation and we act as quickly as possible to implement it. I know that in general terms people don't like regulation. 20 years ago I didn't like it either, but I've now understood that if there's no regulation, nothing will happen for these systems of companies, etc. And then financially, how can institutions accelerate the transformation? Well, there could be a strategy to be carbon neutral, and we can resort to investments that are going to help this area, and they should enable collaborators, and the governments should continue to have a green tax reform and giving some tax benefits to companies and products that can contribute positively to these products. And to know about sustainability, well, we can only know about it by paying courses, post graduations, and the financial sector. How can it work on these topics and support companies to make this transition by giving loans for the energy transition, and to help companies have a better behavior and to create financial products in this sense, and basically to enable their workers internally, because this is a topic that no matter how many schools people attended in the past, but only for the last 5 years have these topics been taught in schools, and there's only been regulation for 2 years. And so to understand this, people have to have a lot of availability to learn, which means that we have to be able to use both sides of the brain, and this is something which is very difficult to do. And that is not to think that we are good managers or good entrepreneurs just because we're rational. So first of all, rational human beings are not rational, and so what we feel is what makes us decide, because most decisions are emotional. The brain manages to stimulate the decision taken by us. So how to use creativity in a different way of seeing problems and decisions is fundamental to move towards a solution of this type, because if we don't do this quickly, we're going to lose the race and it won't be us, it'll be the younger generation. Thank you.
Obrigada. Obrigada, Sofia.
Thank you, Sofia. So you've given us a lot of food for thought. And now, Professor António Sarmento. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Thank you, Fidelidade and Culturgest, for having addressed this invitation to me. And thank you all very much for listening to me. And I'm very pleased to see youngsters, especially on the right-hand side. I think there's a very good sign. I would like to begin by saying that I am an engineer, and engineers look at things a little bit differently from economists, and so I'm going to give you a very personal view. And by following Sofia's introduction about the GDP, I would say the following: only in a disaster is it impossible to bring the GDP down, because nobody wants to. So what's the solution? Is to do things better, and do things better at all levels: social behaviour, individual behaviour, and so the involvement allows us to do better than we have done with what we have available today. So if we think what the challenges that society has, the world has: food, energy, fresh water, health, in a climate or in an environment which is a little bit complicated, because we have climate change, instability. I've got to say a while ago, why is the GDP have to continue to drop? Because not because we want to be more, to consume more, well, probably do, but it's got nothing to do with that, with this. It's got to do with the growth of the world population and the access to Western consumer standards for a greater percentage of this population. In terms of energy, the consumption of energy since I was born in 1952, 70 years ago, it's 7 or 8 times higher today. Why? It's not because we use up a lot of energy, but there's a greater population that wants to have the comfort that we need. And so I'm going to focus on innovation, because I think it's through innovation that we can move forward. And so as I'm an engineer, I think more about technological innovation, but I'll have to make a bridge from time to time to other innovations. So if we start with innovation, I make a distinction between disruptive innovation and constructive innovation. I think it's clear, and I'd like to call your attention to this because there are different challenges, and so we're going to see that disruptive innovation is much more difficult to implement and many more risks. And so here are a number of examples of disruptive innovation. They are developments that are not significantly based on anything that existed before. And so they are very risky, higher innovations with a high risk, because we don't know how they're going to be accepted by society. We don't know what the cost of their development is, how long does it take, etc. On the other hand, there are innovations that came from nothing. There is no value change associated with them. So the innovator quite often is one single person. And in the case of the bulb, it was Edison. And then with Dr. Baumann, the heart transplant, and then Facebook, Zuckerman. And so they're a little bit isolated. They don't have the comfort of having an industry be supporting them. And it's not, they have to support industry. In terms of progressive innovation, the situation is the opposite. We look at a car, for example, and we distinguish a car from 1930 to 2020, but we cannot characterize what was in the origin of the differences that we have visually identified and know that exist in terms of aspect, and the engines are very different, the comfort is very different, the safety is also very different, but to draw up all these individual innovations is impossible. So what are the characteristics of progressive innovation? We don't associate any name with this or that development. In terms of companies, we know there are some companies are more innovative than others. But on the other hand, as they are based on small progressive steps, the risk associated with each one is much less, the cost is much less, and the market risk associated with each one of them is much less too, because this is a continuous process. We know how the market reacts, and so the risk is small. And so, on the other hand, there's a value chain associated with them. I mean, there's a huge value chain with the automobile industry. And this is, we're in a very different situation than the inventor who's all alone and said, look, I'm here, put your hand in here. And this is true for practically all progressive innovations. In all these cases, we can see the role of the individual. The individual is the motor of innovation, and so people are fundamental in innovation. There are other people that is institutions, like the leader institution, which assumes this innovation and which transports it, fuels it, and then there are clusters which are fundamental to support this, because they have knowledge that is not in the leading institution, but is very, very important for the product actually to be marketed. And then there's another innovation agent, which is society, because society is going to determine a number of things. Society determines whether innovation is product is accepted or not. If the society does not have the not want to accept it, then it dies. And so it's very difficult to support development. There are developments that the society appreciates and promotes them, and sometimes there's less appeal, so it doesn't exploit them in the same way. And so society, in addition to have this role of supporter, but also has to regulate through its the competent authorities. So I'm talking about government, public administration bodies. So I can see these four levels of intervening parties with the characteristics I've already mentioned, and they interact a little bit differently, whether innovation is disruptive or progressive. So I'm going to give you two cases, there's two study cases. Well, maybe it's a little bit exaggerated to call them study cases. The two cases that I've studied for over 40 years, which are renewable energies offshore. And so these, there's offshore wind energy and wave energy. These are two technologies which were developed in the 1970s with the energy crisis, and which today are in different situations. In the case of wind energy, we have about 800 gigawatts installed in the world, but I can say that the nuclear reactor has 1 gigawatt, so we're talking about the equivalent to 8,000 gigawatts installed. And so we're talking about a very substantial number. We're talking about a very powerful industry with a very highly developed development chain. And I think the future is going to be this. A couple of years ago, I was part of a more select club, but I think everybody knows that this is what's going to happen. And so this is a very successful technology. And in case of waves, wave energy, the situation is totally different. we have, or rather we have no plants working in the world. We have no product developed, a finished product developed. What we do have are technologists which are developing some at a more advanced stage systems that happen in the world. This is we have seen companies testing innovations and they've not been successful. So what you have, and you're right, is going to be tested in the north of Portugal. It's a Swedish company with whom WavEC has worked with for the last 10 years. We hope it's going to be successful, but there's still a very high risk. And so we have two technologies of which to take advantage of energy and the sea. And so I'm going to try and explain why this, in my opinion, is the case. In the case of wind energy, the process started with small turbines, 30, 40, 100 kilowatts. But the inventors, that is those who developed them, managed to build in their own homes with the investment and everything. It's be 1 megawatt changed to 3. I mean, we're talking about 1,000 kilowatts, so we're talking about 10 times more, 30 times more, and all onshore. And to work onshore is relatively easy. And so the passage of the sea was done in very shallow waters, 3 or 4 meters. And so the turbine, instead of being onshore, was fixed on the bottom, on the seabed. And so this is not so surprising, because we know that there are a number of bridges whose foundations are in the sea. And so this was a very calm process. And then when we went to deeper waters, the structure had to be reinforced, but the tripods are well-known structure, so nothing surprising. And then in 2010, when we went into even more deeper waters, we used turbines on floating structures. But this was already known, because the gas and oil industry has been using solutions of floating structures for decades in order to put the equipment that they need to extract oil. And so in this case, we clearly have a progressive innovation. So these small steps are taken, and so they have they're understood by the investors. So this is quite easy to channel capital, very intensive capital. So it's quite easy to do this. A wind farm, an offshore wind farm, less than 400 megawatt. No, that doesn't exist, but 600, yes. 600, 700 megawatts, about a gigawatt. So, why? The cost of the infrastructure costs so much that is these costs with structures are very high with fewer turbines. These investments are so high that normally an electric energy company doesn't do this on its own. It has a partnership with another. Here we are talking about investments of megawatts at about 4 million euros.
No caso das ondas.
In the case of waves, what's the scenario when they started? Nobody knew how to use energy. There was a great variety of concepts. Many people were saying, well, this can be done this way, that can be done that way. There were about 10, 20, currently more than 100 in different inventions regarding wind energy. So what's the impact? First of all, there's a great efforts are scattered, both human resources and financial resources, so they couldn't choose one single technology, although the one which is being more developed today is this one in the middle, oscillating bodies, the one which is being mostly used. As I was saying, this great variety did not help. It's not possible to develop the wave energy system on land. You have to do it on sea. So when you go on sea, there are costs which are much higher than developing this on land. And also risks, because when you go onto the sea, we never know what we'll find. It's quite frequent to develop an operation and have to go back because the sea does not allow this operation to take place. There are questions of survival. For all these reasons, so it's much more expensive to develop these products, these equipments on sea than on land. And there is no industry dedicated to this, so the comfort that the wind energy started having is not, it does not exist. More recently, the fact that offshore wind energy has been so much developed. We have 34 gigawatts of offshore installed wind energy, 34 generators of nuclear power. It means that investors just consider this a fewer risk to make an investment in a wind farm than in a wave park. So it's much easier to make a private having private investments into wind farms. So there is sub-financing into this type of energy. But the consequences, first of all, one is industrial reality, and the other one is still giving its first steps. I don't know how successful it will be. Finally, the question, will there be a sustainable future? Besides being an engineer, I'm an optimist, so I say yes. But I've got a couple of arguments in favor. Why is there an optimist? If it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, or you should not take it for granted, but I believe that you can get there. This is very much to do to technological evolution. Today we have an ability to monitor what is taking place, which is absolutely extraordinary. It's not just with satellite data, but with the data collected locally from agriculture. So it enables us to be much more effective in doing anything or operating anything, not just having so much data, but the ability to work, to process big data. AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning will enable us to control in great detail practically everything we do. Practically everything, and we'll be able to create digital twins on of an offshore platform. What is a digital twin? It's the construction of a software which represents in great detail what a real structure does, not just because it describes it all, but because it is continuously being nurtured with data which are being collected in real time. So this allows to render the operation of all the systems much more effective. So we think about precision agriculture, we may talk about precision offshore aquaculture, so on and so forth. Why? Because we control it in detail. For instance, in the precision agriculture, we do not irrigate an orchard the same way. We know exactly how each tree, what each tree needs, so we give each tree what it requires. So this ability to be much more efficient than we are today is a very positive factor, and which I consider to be associated to these problems, food, energy and climate change, changes which are going to be more easily detected and controlled, I hope. Finally, I consider that it's very positive, which is not really technological, but the access of the world population to more knowledge in a very direct way via Wikipedia, the internet at large, the access to products, and today anywhere in the country can purchase any product in the world. We have eBay and other platforms for those who live in Lisbon, which can easily purchase whatever they like. It's not so relevant for those living in remote places. It's very important. And we have the social media, which enable us contact one another, not just in society, in our society, Portugal, but across the world. So I believe that all these elements will end up by increasing our interdependency and our solidarity with others and contribute to have a better world, a more sustainable world of lower risk. Because what Sofia said, the biggest problem is the amount of risk we have to deal with. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada, professor António Sarmento.
Thank you, Professor. Before giving the floor to the public for any questions you may have, I'd like to ask you both the same question. You know, the relationship, the umbilical relation between money and nature. So what comes first, capital or the climate urgency? Or the other way around, is the climate emergency that will make money move around, driven by technology and technological innovation and the companies which wish to combat this phenomenon. What is your view, Sofia? Well, this question brings me back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith, a philosopher and economist who somehow created the concept of invisible hand, which led to the market economy, in our view. He was known by having said something like, if each one of us will act individually, protecting our own interests, the society can reach collective well-being. And this is what he called the invisible hand. And those who learn economy learn this, but he only writes in one of his books the expression invisible hand. Before writing this book, which is The Wealth of Nations, he wrote another book, which is the theory of moral feelings, where he defines that the citizen is an ethical being which feels pleasure in other people's happiness. So first of all, he defines who we are. We are an ethical being who enjoys seeing other people's happiness. And then he writes another book where he defines how each one of us interacts, and this makes up the creation of a market. For him, the question of individualism is not what we understand today. When he says that each one of us is an individual being, he's not appealing to selfishness. This is what went into the market economy. He's appealing to entrepreneurship. He's saying that each being has the ability to make the difference, to be an entrepreneur, of creating new things, and he believes that this individual enjoys seeing other people's happiness. So I'm not going to do anything to hurt the others, because I'm not going to feel as joy. So what we have forgotten to teach, this precisely, the fundamental of Adam Smith theory.
E o respeito pelo outro.
It's based upon respect and the notion that we are happier and we're even more pleased by making other people happy. So we have taken all this away from these our theory. So if that's the case, we are never concerned with other people's happiness in general.
Nas universidades de economia não nos ensinam isso.
So we're not taught this in the economics college. We are taught to maximize profit. We never told that we should decrease impact on others. So this led to a wrong concept of the market economy, which is not the market economy concept, which leads to many shortcomings in the market. The fact that the climate is a shortcoming in this, because nobody paid any attention to it, because we're not thought that the climate can make somebody unhappy. So what is happening now? Now, nowadays, given that the climate is having an impact upon companies, so it's a selfish viewpoint because the climate has an impact on businesses. Businesses are thinking about, well, see how going to prevent a further impact from the climate. So we reached the conclusion, finally, that money, which makes the world goes round, also is very important for climate. So if I want to have a climate with less risk, with less climate change, I have to place money aligned with projects that are going to decrease the environmental risk. I don't know if I fully replied to a question. Yes, I believe you did, because the idea is that we should have started think about these before, but when we generated so much capital, so many consumerism, so many companies, even technological companies, only after generating all this money, suddenly we start to realize that this is having an impact upon climate. So, and this impact upon climate that we know exists for many years now, we have to pay attention to it. But now that climate has a big impact upon businesses, which is called double materiality, well, now, yes, now the climate change have an impact. Now we have suddenly woken up when probably it should have been at the basis of all our theories. It has to do with the scenario that Professor has talked about of wash-off energy and wave energy. So 20 years testing this energy is a great deal of time for the planet to see some results. What is lacking? Investment? Innovation is there, but it has many obstacles. Or there is innovation, there is capital, but it's not being directed towards the right things. In relation to your question regarding wave energy and wind farms, I suppose that part of the problem is capital. But I can't accuse capital of failing, because if there is wind farms that complies with the same objective with lower risk and lower costs, of course, this is where the capital is going to invest. But we can ask that, what are the benefits will wave energy can bring to exploit wind energy? There are no benefits. This is why we keep on investing. Benefits such as complementarity at the source. Waves are much more stable. If I have waves today, within 3 days I will still have waves, so there is a stability of several days. Waves do not disappear. And they are created, maybe you don't know this, we import waves. Waves are generated in the middle of the Atlantic near Iceland. This is where they are generated, and they come here without dispersing any energy practically. So if I'm asked tomorrow, in 3 days' time, are there waves? You just look at the map, they are progressing in this direction. So we can forecast waves 5-7 days in advance. So it's a very stable source in opposition to wind, which is more unstable. So it's something good in wave energy. There may be other interesting factors which are more specific, having to do with the operations of the wave energy parks, or rather wind farm, because of the protection that the wind parks can bring, or the wind farms can bring. But investment is in wind farms. Maybe in a couple of years' time we will start seeing the same investment in wave energy. Now, in relation to your question, there's an example which is very interesting, and I agree with Sofia. Obviously, these problems started being felt in the 70s. Some started feeling it. There is a great deal of inertia, and finally it reached the well of capital because of pressures of the population, and because companies themselves, the industry, understand that there's a situation of risk which affects them, namely the insurers, because we do not really know what are the impacts of climate change in the assets in the world, and so the insurance companies feel this risk. There is a project which is very interesting called Poseidon project, which is as follows. More than 90% of banks funding shipping, maritime transportation, have agreed in this project. They define for each ship owner a pollution level per ton per kilometer and per ton of merchandise transported. And this standard means that if a ship owner is above this level, they will not fund it. They may finance measures for them to lower the emission of greenhouse gas effects, but they do not finance any other ships. And this threshold is decreasing every year. It's precisely a very effective reaction to improve environmental performance of maritime transportation. And other sectors will do something similar, which, in relation to your question, I believe that first is the environment, and then there is a reaction to the environment. This is not just in the capital market, in relation to all the rest. We have so much sea. Listening to Sofia, the problem of glaciers, which can become the next pandemic, the increase of the sea level, it's a concern. What would you do, Professor? Let's imagine that you have all the capital in the world to do something, and do something soon. What would be the first action? For us to be able, huge resource which is at the sea. We have energy, biodiversity, and use it into so many different markets. So what would your first action? The question requires a reply which should be much reflected upon. Well, we must have data. I would invest in data. In Portugal, and its the exclusive economic zone, we don't have enough data. Let me give you two examples. Nobody measured, or it's not at least public, EDP's got it because it has an offshore wind farm, but we do not know the waves on the sea, and the type of wind. The type of winds is essential to see whether we can use the winds or the waves at sea. But the wind farm is the wind speed is proportional to the Cuba's speed. It means that one error of 1% in measuring wind gives an error to 3% in economic return. And one error of 1% is not much, but if it's an error of 5%, 9% makes an investment unfeasible. And this is not known. And a country that wishes to initiate an auction for 10 gigawatts is doing it without an in-depth knowledge of the winds we have. We know approximately what the winds are like because we have mathematical models that tell us, but one thing is mathematical models and a different thing is measurement. Likewise, we do not know what is the temperature profile in the water in the column when I go to the surface down into the sea. We don't know the temperature. This is essential for aquaculture, but there are two decisive parameters in aquaculture. Temperature, water temperature, and the quality of the feed. The water temperature determines whether the fish will grow or not, because the fish does not sufficiently control its temperature. So if the temperature is outside its standard, it does not grow. And the quality of the feed, fish meal, because we're going to, we eat fish and we want to eat something tasty. I made this research some 5 years ago. We only have one point in our coast at Glaciers where they measure for 1 year the water temperature in depth of 50 meters deep. You don't have any other measurement done. So when you talk about offshore aquaculture, there's an obstacle. We don't know what are the conditions, and we know the temperatures because of numeric models, but we don't have the real measurements. So the more knowledge, more data. We should also rapidly evolve to create areas in the ocean. I use a term that the biologists don't like. The maritime zones which are benefits. They say that nature does it all. We can't improve on nature. So the idea is to have a wind farm producing energy. We have aquaculture of algae, which produces food, raw materials, and absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere. We may have aquaculture of
Melhoram a qualidade da água, mas criam alimentos.
of bivalves, and we can have, of course, aquaculture of fish, which doesn't have such beneficial effects. But if I have this and I have a digital twin in that region, if things are properly equipped and models including all this information, I can say that this area is good. In environmental terms, this area is more than protected. I'm absorbing CO2, it's filtering water, so it's an area with benefits. It means that whatever is produced in that water has a quality stamp that others don't. I've been talking about this for more than a year. There are many obstacles because the owner of a wind farm doesn't want to have other uses surrounding it, precisely because the investment levels it represents, and maybe because the way the insurers will react. If you have a 4 billion euros investment or 2 billion euros, and there are some people with an investment of 100 or 200 million euros, that may increase risk. We're going to increase the insurance premium, so the owner of the wind farm is not interested. So I believe that this is a path that shall be followed. You have this idea of community. So this has another impact, which is creating jobs. And it also goes back to Adam Smith. We should be pleased with other people's happiness to have these energies of well-being and community. I'd like to put more questions, but we are lagging behind, I'm afraid. So I'd like to hear from you. Who's got questions for our speakers? What are your ideas? We have somebody. 2 questions from the floor.
Boa tarde.
I picked up 2 questions from the presentation by Sofia. One is that growth itself may create the conditions to eat itself or to destroy itself. So it will be the destructive effects in the GDP in the way growth is taking place. The other takeaway was the frightening perspectives ahead of us, where on one hand we may have an orderly transition, but there are 2 other scenarios, and we can't say that we won't get a hothouse where there will be a complete chaos, and we have to prevent this from happening. We will have to be able to undergo an orderly transition as quickly as possible. As Kenneth Boulding would say, if a person believes that in a finite planet is still impossible to grow indefinitely, he was an economist who said that a person who believes this is either mad or an economist. So we've seen that it's not just economists. The question is, in this framework of a need for a change of culture, what can we do so that we can rapidly guarantee that an orderly transition can take place? This is a $1 million question. This is what we'd like to know, Sofia. What I will say will sound common sense, but it's the only possible reply. If you just want to, in the different roles, for instance, if I'm a father, I can't. But if I'm the chairman of the board, maybe I don't want to so much. I interact with many businesses, small and big. It's very interesting to understand how things work. I've been undergoing some training how the financial sector can implement regulation. There's always, or there are a series of people that it goes beyond rational. So the questions they ask, how can I do the right thing? But there are many people, and the questions they ask is, how can I just turn around, overcome this obstacle? If I have someone in front of me who is in the training on a topic which has the goal of placing the financial sector aligned with 1.5 degrees to save the planet, and when they are asking me questions, how can I overcome this issue, this problem of regulation? I can do nothing because the person has not yet understood where we stand. So what's the basis? A great deal of capacity building in companies. There is someone who has never had the right training on this topic, so they ask questions which are stupid questions because they do not want to understand that these questions are stupid, and they believe that the question they asking, they rather know the answer. They're not being a scientist. And in the world of finance, we have many people who believe that they have an opinion on science and never had anything about science. So the answer is that people just have to be aware, and they have the same aware when they're parents, when they get home to the end of the day and saying to their children over dinner, what are the decisions that I made? Am I ashamed of sharing the decisions, or do I feel proud of my decisions? This is basically this at the end of the day. We have regulation, we have money to for investments, despite the difficulty of these investments, which are the most difficult investments to make. The world has lots of money to do so. And those people with the money, they do not know where to make investments. We have regulation. And we have human beings who on the streets demonstrate in favor of the environment. At home, they defend the environment, but they, in terms of their decisions as managers and businessmen, they try to escape regulation. So how do you increase awareness? Just building the capacity of people, and universities have to speak out, because it's the only way of people truly understanding what we're talking about.
Obrigada, Sofia. E já estamos ali mais uma pergunta.
I think we have another question over there.
Está. É uma pergunta para a Sofia.
There's a question for Sofia Santos.
É objetivamente preocupante. Depois o António Sarmento.
António Sarmento then was a little bit more optimistic than Sofia's. And leaving us with hope about what technology could do. So António mentioned what techno fixes will So António Sarmento was more or less worried. Technology is available, there's money, regulation exists, international pressure exists, and so why are we moving towards 3.2 degrees? Because we don't want to change. And so decision makers are not making the changes with at the pace of the resources available. We have money with regulation. The next community support framework is going to lend money to companies that do not damage the environment. We have a whole ideal context, and even so, we're moving towards 3.2 degrees, even with all this available technology. Why? Because the human beings don't want to change their comfort zone, and so they think the problem is not going to affect them, and so they're not worried about the future. I don't think it's because we don't believe that technology is going to resolve this. I think it's a question of comfort zone. We're so comfortable. Only if we leave our comfort zone can we evolve to feel other people's pain. Going to Africa and see how other people suffer. So to go into cold houses and see how difficult it is to sleep in a very cold house. I remember the images that you showed us of the factories in India, child labour, etc. This to try and live like that and experience these and see how the others live. That's an opportunity. Most of us don't have this opportunity. This lack of empathy makes us remove ourselves from the problem, and so we manage to take the decision slowly. So we think everybody's wrong except the scientists. I think the economists, that they have the gunpowder. We know how to talk about science without having ever had a class. I'm not at all optimistic, even though the technology is available. Can I make a comment here? Yeah. The gentleman speaking with no mic. Good afternoon. So how is the distribution of public revenues is made? I mean, well, we have to look at the budget, and so we can see how that is given to the improvement of renewable energies, etc., is very little. And so do this think about winning the elections in the future. So the politician works for 4 years and they're voters, but the younger voters are voters, say this everywhere, and they shouldn't go to the Ministry of the Environment, they should go to the Ministry of Finances to demonstrate, because that's what the problem is. So politicians have a medium-term mind, 4 years, so the many managers have to make quarterly reports, so they have a 4 monthly mind. So that some people think they are aware of, they should know what they're doing and don't do it, or react in the short term. That is what the political world does, and a lot of the world, the financial corporate world does, because they have shareholders that pressurize them, and the clients what stimulus do they have, and that's what we have. You're either aware or you have a stimuli which are not there. So you would also like to ask something. 2 things. First of all, I would like to say the following. So the presentation I made was limited to try and show you that without technology we're not going anywhere. I work in marine renewable energy since '78. To classify my presentations as techno fix, I think it's a bit of bad taste. And so I would like to give my contribution in a different way, that is to explain, in my opinion, the changes take time, and it's not credible. if I say that in 10 years they install the equivalent to 10 megawatts, we shouldn't put things aside. In the next 20 years we can do 3 times as much as we've done before. So we have signs which are very positive in terms of energy transformation. It takes about 10-15 years before that's possible. So we must have a notion of how things are how long things are going to take. So it's counterproductive to keep thinking that the world is getting worse. And all the indicators that we have on the evolution of mankind are positive, even though we think that things are going backwards. Why? Because we have a lot more access to information. Most of the information, it gives us negative information. So we have this image that the world is getting worse and worse. More questions? Good afternoon. The question I've got is to have a better environment, will companies have to lower their productivity? And if so, how are they going to do this in relation to the decrease of the financial economy in the world? Companies do not have to lower the productivity. So to lower their environmental footstep doesn't mean that there'll be fewer investments. The environment is not bad. So we can lower CO2 by increasing the level of efficiency, changing processes, by using raw materials, residues of other industries. So this idea that I can only lower CO2 emissions if I reduce production is wrong. You have to think about this. And what I'm also saying is that we have environmental pressure doesn't mean unemployment. On the contrary, it means that we have more people to think, and creativity and innovation to know how I can produce more with less. And so that says meet necessities better for more populations with a much more efficient process and more ecological process throughout its own value chain. I don't know whether I answered, because thank you, yes you did. No. Any more questions? I would just like to say good afternoon. When you talk about your pessimism and you say that we have to get out of our comfort zone, my view is that we're not in a comfort zone. Full stop. We have to leave here because it's not comfortable. This morning I heard somebody say that we are here between the end of the world and the end of the month. So I think all the countries in the world are living this today. A despair, total despair, of not having a perspective which corresponds to the progress that society has been creating in these last 100 years. We have to understand that our children are going to be in a better situation, but sometimes I suffer from anxiety because I quite often can't see this for my children, and I know I'm going to be alive suffering with these questions. So from the point of view of the economy, there is money, there's technology, and there's a desire, and there's another thing which is very serious, that those who have to change don't want to change because of these big companies who have to change, but they've got this chip here, and do what Sofia mentioned. which is to understand that we can have a green economy and we can continue to producing. It's not productivity is not related to the paradigm shift in the economy. So the question I have for both of you is a proposal involves society and fundamentally involves leaders, the governments and companies. What is the advice that you would have for these new companies who have these new governors, new CEOs? To fulfill, to create a green economy. So that's company institutions. So what can sort of be the catalyst of all this? I would say fiscal policy and a good education policy. If we have a fiscal policy, companies react. And if we have an education policy, then so in terms of green economy, to encourage and communicate to companies what they can do, co-fund this, and to get the right people to ask the right questions and to vote on the best and not do what I did, to keep away from politics, because when we keep away from politics, the end result is normally not very good, and we have an end result in Europe that may not be very good for that group that's over there in 15 years' time.
Não, eu só queria dizer que estou,
I would just like to say that I agree.
obviamente, fiscal e, sobretudo, da parte do conhecimento. E no conhecimento há vários.
And so knowledge at various levels. Scientific, to have a better knowledge of the population, but also from the population, because the population decides, and we have to convey to the population what we're worried about. And as I'm an optimist, not only what we're worried about, but what can remove concerns. Thank you. So I think there was also another question here. Thank you.
Esta questão da educação, não é? Que são as novas gerações também acabam por...
So it's not really a question.
Eu nas empresas...
So the comments. So in companies, I don't see lack of awareness. There's a major concern. Well, I think that solutions, we know what they are, 40% of discursive technology. We've already talked about this. We need time to gain scale, 40% of solutions. So here, I'm talking about a number of studies, not only consultants, but stakeholders, 40% have solutions, deficient solutions. So we need more circular energy efficiency, etc. in such solutions, and 20% for McKinsey. So 20%. As with this inertias, but for a company to define, I don't believe in a GDP that's going to make an economy grow when there's no environment that can survive. When we're talking about sobriety, where am I going to... We know that my carbon footprint has to be reduced, so there has to be a sacrifice. What's the best trade-off today in order to have a medium or long-term benefit? If companies are taking so much time, it's because this trade-off is very difficult, because this is going to mean unemployment. Maybe in this case transition is not a stable, durable phase. So I share your optimism under the condition that we can take decisions that can lead us to certain economic consequences, suffering, and there can be serious consequences. We talk about transition, green, fair transition, but solutions exist. What we are talking about today is we have to think how far a company can go in order to grow and in order to have more durable practices. That's why we're taking so long, not because the companies have the ethics. I mean, we are all part of a company. Thank you. So for this transition phase, I continue to say the same thing. We have to have our expectations, correct expectations. If we expect things to be resolved in a very short time with very little effort, things are going to go bad. And once again, I could say that all the energy infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, is not changed from one day to another. We're talking about years, a decade. So there's not much to do. And the other aspect that you mentioned, which is important, is that we are in a time of change, and this transition has costs, and that has to be accepted quite often because of lack of knowledge, reflection. Society does not accept these transition costs and ends up by not moving on with this transition because it's not accepted. So we have to work to ensure that this transition there've always been transitions, and transitions, there are jobs that are lost, some jobs, some are made. So more access to information, society has a greater difficulty in accepting this, and the more information societies have, they could bridge the gaps. They're thinking that a number of people are going to lose their jobs, or there are other jobs, for example. That's on one hand. But transitions have always existed, but just on another one. So whether it's my statement is positive or negative, so what we have to do is to have courage to act quickly. We've had this information since the 70s. I'm not saying it's the end of the world. I mean, we may decide not to do anything, but we must be aware of it. We decided to do that. And we know that in 15 years' time, we'll be in a hothouse, and it's going to be hot, it's going to be catastrophic, there's going to be hurricanes, fires, etc., but it's an option. So not take fast questions, get the right answers and quick answers today. There's money, there's technology, and so we have to go towards 3.2 centigrades. The only thing we have to do is accelerate the decisions because they take time to be implemented, but we do have this information. We've had it for over 50 years. So it's time decisions were made, and we have regulation which makes us comply with this. So just a short comment. Sometimes we tend to look at things. The society is sufficiently rich to put an end to this to put an end to. But if we look at the end of the world, there are people, many people who just want to live a little bit better, and I think that's part of the problem. And on the other hand, these populations are those who are going to suffer more with climate change. So these populations now, which are trying to have a better life, for those who are going to suffer more with our impacts. But they have difficulty to say this and don't react. I'm very sorry, but we have to put an end to this conversation. I know we had some more questions to ask, but we're not going to be able to continue because we're already late. And I hope that you can manage to ask your questions to our speakers, maybe during the coffee break, or through the internet or social network. And so this topic, we could go on and on and on all day talking about this, but I apologise to those who didn't manage to get their questions asked, and I would like to say that I thoroughly enjoyed being here. This debate was very interesting, and I hope to see you again soon, and I hope your conferences are very interesting. Thank you.